Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellbite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. First and foremost, you guys will notice that this is recycled footage because I was trying to find another game that would accurately illustrate my point, but this is actually the best example I had recently, so we are going to be re-showing it, as today's video is all about how to deal with a cheese lane. Now, the first thing you guys are probably wondering is, what the heck is a cheese lane? I know a lot of people generally know what I mean when I say that, but in case you don't, here is generally what I mean, which is a cheese lane. If you consider how the game is regularly played, right? Most of the time, the game is optimized for the map and for general terms of gameplay, right? Most teams are going to want 1 to 2 frontliners and an AD carry. They usually want at least some degree of mix of magical and physical damage. And generally, the kinds of champions that get played in each lane are essentially mathed out in advance, right? It makes sense to play tanks and fighters and other relatively sustain-y champions in the top lane because of how little attention they get. It makes sense to play the AD carry and support in the bottom lane because that's where Drake is, and that's where a lot of the focus is going to be for the first part of the game. So having the majority of your champions on that side of the map makes a lot of sense. Mid lane, you want champions that can roam or wave clear quite well, so you can abuse their ability to, being in the center of the map, you can use their ability to roam and help other lanes or the jungler, right? All this stuff is kind of makes sense, and it's kind of been inherited into the game as League of Legends has developed. This shouldn't surprise anybody about how we play the game. A cheese lane, conversely, is something where essentially players deliberately choose things that are not optimized in favor of abusing some kind of advantage that non-optimization does. So basically what I'm saying is, in the long run, right, having an AD carry is a huge advantage because you have all the gold being funneled into one champion who's going to be able to build critical strike chance, which is a super powerful build, and be very, very difficult to deal with at the end of the day. And that's essentially the most optimal way to play the game, right? We've kind of understand that an AD carry is very effective. However, AD carries do have a lot of weaknesses. They're very weak early game. They have to be able to get gold in order to get their build online. It's not enough to have experience. They do need to be able to last hit, and they can be quite weak in the early game. Like I said, that's why they get a support to protect them. And so there are ways of then abusing these champions in order to gain an advantage. If you pick something like a double mage bot lane or a double bruiser bot lane, well, all of a sudden, AD carries look incredibly weak. While they're okay with dealing with enemy supports and enemy AD carries, both of whom are generally weak in the early stages of the game, an AD carry is nowhere near prepared to deal with the early level power of something like a Darius or the constant poke of something like, let's say, a Lux or a Xerath, right? That's kind of how the game has been. That's just kind of how it shapes up because these champions are significantly better in the early game. And so by essentially exploiting the early game, right, a cheese lane is attempting to snowball an advantage off of that, so that way they never have to reckon with the fact that they don't have an AD carry or that they don't have a frontliner or that they generally played a suboptimal champion in that particular position, because they're attempting to use that potential advantage gained by something weird or something unique or interesting that the picks can do in order to get that advantage. So in that regard, you can see these lanes kind of especially stomp lower elos because players don't really understand how these lanes work or what the disadvantages for these lanes are. They see it and they say, well, you know, that's completely stupid. Why does that work? Well, it's essentially because they're trying to abuse something about the champion that is throwing away the late game, unless they are able to make it happen in the early stages of the game, at which point then it doesn't matter that it was cheesy because it succeeded. This isn't just bot lane, by the way. This does also happen in other lanes. I think we can all think about things like Tristana or Vayne top lane, for example, which is abusing generally melee champions top lane in order to gain advantage by being able to farm it out, get a whole solo lane's worth of experience and gold on one champion, while also being able to bully the enemy top laner out of any golden experience that they might try to get because they are melee. Or something like a Twitch jungle, right, which is a super big cheese pick, because in that essentially attempts to abuse Twitch's on-demand stealth in the early stages of the game, as well as being able to grab red buff early on, and just make a really cheesy level 2 gank happen that no one sees coming because junglers don't normally gank that early, and wards won't catch them out because Twitch can stealth up, walk into lane, and then immediately open up with his damage. So, like I said, generally that's what I mean when I'm talking about what a cheese lane sort of is. But I don't think that these are that big of a deal to deal with once you sort of understand how to deal with them. And that's essentially why I have pulled up this footage here, because it's a very good example of how we handle what we knew was a cheese lane going into the game. But once we saw the Swain picked up in the brand, we're like, okay, yeah, that's probably something really ridiculous bot lane. So here's how we're going to deal with it. So there are two main ways that you can deal with something like this cheese lane, or something like this sort of lane that's attempting to abuse a certain aspect of the lane. And that's that you know what a cheese lane wants to do for the most part. It's not a secret when they play play Brand, Swain, bot lane, what exactly that lane is trying to do. Right, that lane is attempting to abuse the early game power of mages, especially in regards to their poke, constantly forces out of lane, and maybe even look for a kill if they can land something like a Brand stun or a Swain root into the Swain passive pull, into all of their burst damage, and essentially kill the AD carry before they have any opportunity to do anything about it. Something like double-bruiser bot lane is going to look to all-in you early and often and constantly in order to abuse the power that bruisers have in the early game versus an AD carry. If you're looking at something like an AD carry top lane, something like the Tristana or Vayne top, that's attempting to abuse the poke advantage they have in order to sort of gain advantage over the long run by constantly forcing enemy champions out, right? We kind of already went through what makes these lanes strong, but what I'm saying is that these are very obvious strategies. You should know going into it exactly what their game plan is going to be, and therefore you can play around it, right? Knowing that it's going to be double mage bot lane, knowing that the poke is going to be coming out, it makes a lot of sense to then play defensively, to swap the rune setup around, to kind of say, okay, we know it's going to be double mage, so it makes sense then to, you know, try to buy items or try to adapt the rune page to have more lifesteal, to have more sustain, or to just have more defenses. I think a very underrated rune, for example, is going into Resolve for second wind and things of the like, in order to just make sure that you gain additional health back every time they hit you, right? Or going for the biscuits and free boots, because that is sort of something that allows you to avoid that damage to get some free gold, so even if you can't last hit perfectly, you do have that, and biscuits for a little bit of added sustain to help keep you in lane a little bit longer. Alternatively, you can choose to buy early boots instead of going immediately for your damage items, because that gives you the movement speed to either kite back against bruisers or to avoid these skill shots of mages. So generally, you know what these kinds of champions are going to be attempting to abuse. Now, it's a little bit difficult, more difficult if you're on your own, but there are still ways of dealing with it. Some cheesy jungler, for example, like Twitch, can be countered if you are the jungler by invading them. Those kinds of junglers tend to be very, very weak. They have very unhealthy clears and very slow clears. So a simple champion showing up in their jungle is a huge deal for these sort of weak early game junglers that are attempting to abuse jungle itemization or something like Red Smite. The other advantage you have, and the other thing you can do in order to deal with it, is to simply know exactly what the champion is going to do. Twitch jungle, it should not be a surprise that the champion is ganking at level 2. So even doing something as simple as starting the game with a pink ward, maybe choosing a bit more of a defensive item build at the beginning in order to afford a pink ward, or simply playing back and being very defensive, knowing that there's likely to be a level 2 gank, sort of makes a lot of sense from that regard, and being able to say, okay, yeah, we know exactly what they're going to do, so we can try to plan around that. Top lane is a little bit different because you are on your own, but at least being able to say, hey, jungler, come top because I'm going to be constantly pushed in, or to itemize accordingly instead of going Gore Drinker, going something like Stride Breaker to let you close the gap on these ranged champions top lane. There are ways for you to deal with that as well, if you kind of think about how you can adapt your build to compensate for the disadvantages that you may find yourself at in the cheese lane. In worst case scenario, a lot of times, because of how they've picked, it is easy to just kind of say, all I have to do is just survive the lane, right? There's no reason for me to try and play into whatever advantages these guys are trying to find. It may make sense to just say, I'll play back, I will concede some space in order to just make sure I can stay in lane as long as possible and get as much CS as possible, because there is a disadvantage to playing the game in this regard. Even though it doesn't seem like it, there is a disadvantage to trying some kind of ludicrous strategy like this, and so simply saying, I won't let you abuse that advantage can give you all the advantage you need to succeed. The other thing you can do is to pick to counter the enemy team's strategy. So, like I said, you know what they're doing. You can kind of see the cheese lane forming in champ select. Even you know, I can see all the time when an enemy team picks Vayne, I kind of have to wonder if that is going to be a Vayne top and have to plan my pick accordingly. But you can either, you know, so you can look at what they're doing and kind of know in advance what it is they're trying to set up. So being able to look at something and say, okay, yeah, I know that's going to be a Vayne top lane or Tristana top lane. So instead, I'm going to go ahead and play something like Malphite, because he's going to be able to stack armor, which will limit the amount of poke he takes, and that's going to give him the advantage in the later stages once he has level 6 and can press R on top of the enemy AD carry and do a ton of damage, reducing their attack speed, right? There are a lot of aspects that Malphite in particular brings against enemy AD carries. In a similar fashion, bot lane, right? This particular game in particular, we did pick the Sivir Yuumi specifically because we knew it was going to be a cheese lane. The Yuumi is going to give extra sustain to live through mage poke. Sivir has a spell shield that makes it very difficult for either of these two champions to actually start anything on top of her. So we have sort of an in-lane counter pick to what they're trying to do. The other thing you can do, of course, is if they're cheesing, so can you. If you suspect that that's going to be something like a Vayne top lane, then why would you bother playing a traditional melee top laner when instead you could play something like, let's say, an assassin or a burst mage or something else that is going to then counter the Vayne, who now doesn't have a support to keep her safe in the early stages of the game, right? There are ways of saying, well, if you're not going to play the game accordingly, then I won't either, and we'll see who can win the early game. And that is a viable way to actually look at strategy and to say, hey, if they're going to do something ridiculous, then of course, so will I. So a couple of different ways for you guys to think about how to deal with these sort of cheesy lanes that you may find in your games. But let me know what you guys think of any of this down in the comments section below. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts and kind of what you think of this concept and the strategies I've given you guys to think about in order to deal with these types of combos. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.